Would you like to hear the latest insights into what media and content people are consuming, where, how, who, what's in, what's out, and most importantly, what it means for you and your audience? Listen on to find out. You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods and I'm here to help you maximise your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, CEO and founder of Content 10x, and this week's episode is about the findings of the Infinite Dial 2022 report and my takeaways on how this relates to you as marketers and content creators. Now, it's become somewhat of a tradition to do an episode on the Infinite Dial, and I always get really good feedback, so I didn't want to break that tradition, so I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm going to cover what the Infinite Dial is, in case you're not familiar, interesting findings in relation to how and where people consume content, also the most and least popular social media platforms and how the landscape is changing, and also podcasting and interesting insights to consider in relation to your audience. Okay, so let's jump in. So the Infinite Dial is America's longest running survey of digital media consumer behaviour in America. It's tracked annually and has been since 1998, and it unveils the latest research in digital audio, social media, mobile, smart speakers and podcast consumption. It's conducted by Edison Research, and this year it was sponsored by Wondery and Art19. And it's really been the backbone of the podcasting industry in particular for reliable data. And that's why I always like to do an episode on it to share what's going on in the podcast industry, but also in social media and how we consume media overall. Now this year, Edison Research Senior Vice President Tom Webster presented the findings on stage at Podcast Movement Evolutions in Los Angeles in March. So let's just take a moment to look at this from a repurposing perspective because I find it really interesting. So it's a survey turned into a research report that usually every year is presented as a popular webinar, which is a good example of repurposing in itself. But then this year they went a step further and they presented it as a live talk at the event Podcast Movement, which was also broadcasted live online as well as in person. And it's still a webinar, so the recording of that is on their website as a webinar recording. So I just think that's a really great example of repurposing. If you run surveys and create reports, think about this. Could you repurpose in the same way? Check out episode 222 called How to Repurpose a White Paper or Research Report into a Webinar. And also watch out for our episode coming soon with Michelle Lynn on how to repurpose research reports. Okay, so just a little segue there, but I just thought I would mention the repurposing that these guys do of this report. Now, a few more things on the Infinite Dial. It's based on an American audience aged 12 plus, and they use what's defined as the gold standard of nationally representative survey research, which is random probability telephone samples. And this year's report was based on 1,502 respondents. Now, there's loads of findings in this report and I'll link to it in the show notes, but let's look at the ones I think are most relevant to content creators and marketers. Firstly, in the report, we find out where people are working, whether at home, office, or a hybrid mix of both. And this makes a difference to our behaviours and habits that will definitely impact our media consumption. For example, if we no longer commute to the office or commute to school, and commuting was where we were listening to our podcasts, does that mean that we're seeing a lot less people listen to podcasts? So we'll see that's something that Edison Research tried to look at in this report. Now, they found that comparing 2021 to 2022, there were 5% more people back in the office or school, basically out of the house. So that number was 75% in total. Then there's 20% that say they are still mainly at home and 5% that say they're a mix. In terms of the devices that we use, well, smartphones have plateaued at 88% for the past few years. So 88% of the US adult population are estimated to have a smartphone. Tablets are the same in terms of they seem to have plateaued as well. They've risen a little bit actually from 51% to 53%, but have been hovering around 51 to 53 for the past 3 years or so. Smartwatches, though, have increased, and so have smart speakers. In fact, an estimated 100 million Americans, that's 35%, have smart speakers. Now, 2 years ago, that was 27%, so that's quite a big increase in 2 years. And it's mainly Amazon Alexa devices that people have. It's really interesting to see that more and more households have more than one device as well. In fact, an estimated 33% have more than 3 devices in their house. I can completely relate to this because we have 4 Amazon Alexa devices in our house. What does this all mean? Well, for audio creators, are you tapping into the potential of smart speakers? Is it possible for people to listen to your content on an Amazon Alexa device, the most popular smart speaker? Could you repurpose your content in a format that would work on Alexa? And we're also seeing in with smart speakers and out with radios, there's been a huge change from 4% of households saying they didn't have a radio in 2008 to 29% saying they didn't have one in 2018 to 39% saying that they don't have one in 2022. So that's unsurprising, and also it's the younger people without one and the age 55 plus who do have a radio in their house. Now, I don't have a radio. I do listen to the radio sometimes, but that would be in the car, and Edison research shows that I'm definitely not alone there. And of course, you can listen to the radio in other ways than on a radio at home, on your computer, on your phone, on a smart speaker. You don't actually need a radio. But what is this all telling us or reminding us? So when I think about all of this and I look at this information on the different devices that we have, the devices that are becoming more popular and less popular, something that really jumps out is coming back to the fact that so many people have smartphones. It's actually plateaued, and that there are less tablets now. So smartphones have become so good that I think perhaps we've skipped tablets and we have a laptop or a desktop computer and a good smartphone, and perhaps not as many people are looking for that tablet in between as well. It's reminding me that most people look at our content on the small screen of a phone. So our job is to make our graphics and our videos and our content overall interesting and engaging on a small screen. Now, most people likely discover and engage with us on their smartphone. So we need to factor that in when we think about our audience's journey and how they consume our content. Now, this is a good segue into the social media aspect of the report. 235 million Americans are on social media. That's 82%. Now, this has plateaued like smartphone usage has. The big standout in this report when it comes to social media is definitely TikTok. 88% of people are familiar with it. Instagram and Facebook are higher at 91 and 95, but TikTok has risen from nowhere really. When it comes to actual usage of the platform, it's sitting there at number 3, 36%, and that's from 11% 2 years ago. Instagram has 46% and Facebook 63%. Now, both of them haven't really changed much. There's been some growth with Instagram. But with TikTok, we've seen this big growth. With TikTok's growth, Snapchat has declined. So that's not surprising, really. Twitter has grown from 21 to 27% in 2 years. So that's good to see one of the OG platforms really still growing. And LinkedIn has taken a dip, but only just, so 22 to 21%. But that seems to plateau around that point. There hasn't been much change with LinkedIn for quite a few years. What is really interesting about TikTok is the growth across all age groups. So it's not a young person's platform exclusively. It has grown with younger people for sure, but it's also grown across all age groups. And there's been a huge growth in the age 55 plus. Now, Facebook remains very popular with the older age category as well, though. So what do we take away from this? Well, on the one hand, you'd think it's don't ignore TikTok and everyone should get on TikTok. And in many ways, I think that's not bad advice. I do think it should be taken seriously as a place to grow an audience. We can clearly see that the audience is there on TikTok and it's a broad audience and the content is very popular and it's captivating people. But as with my advice always, go where your audience are and don't spread yourself too thin. Now, I think there are repurposing opportunities when getting into TikTok, but you do need to consider that content for TikTok is very specific. So you need to consider the platform and you need to spend time there, like really do spend the time on the platform to understand it, see what's working. Instagram Reels content is definitely the most similar to TikTok. So if you're on Instagram, think about having a Reels and TikTok combined strategy that could work, but that's just a whole other podcast episode and that's coming very soon. So watch this space on TikTok repurposing. Hey, just a little break from this week's episode to let you know about becoming a Content 10x Insider. If you want more content repurposing tips and advice, then why not join hundreds of business owners, marketers and content creators who get them delivered straight to their inbox once a week by subscribing to the Content 10x newsletter. As well as tips and advice, you get industry updates, inspiring stories, exclusive content, offers and more. You can subscribe at content10x.com/newsletter and there's a link in the show notes too. Okay, back to this week's episode. Now, loads of people I find laugh at Facebook these days and say, who's even on there anymore? But in the USA, the answer is an estimated 180 million, so a lot of people. So it may have seen a decline, but it's not like it's going anywhere. And as with all aspects of marketing, it's about your audience and no one else's. LinkedIn, the platform that I spend the most time on, and I'd guess many listeners to this show spend a lot of time on LinkedIn as well, doesn't really have the huge numbers. 21% are estimated to be using it, and this surprises me. But then I think it just shows that we can end up in these bubbles and echo chambers too, and that's why these reports are really interesting, to just open up our eyes and see on a bigger, more grander scale what's happening. Even though that number isn't high for me, I know my audience are there and I will still have a focus there, but I won't ignore the other growing platforms too. Now, the report also looked at audio content and very much concluded that more people are listening to online audio. An estimated 209 million people in the last month have been listening to online audio content. That's 73%. That's a lot of people. The weekly number is 67%, so it's still high and growing. And that's across many brands as well, so Spotify in the clear lead, but the online audio brands also listened to last month were YouTube, Pandora, Apple, Amazon, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, and I'm sure many more. Now, this isn't specifically about podcasts, I'm talking about online audio covering different types of online audio, but it's still really important. Are you making sure your podcast is everywhere if you have one? It takes no more effort really, once set up, to be on all of the main apps. So make sure that if you have a podcast that you are set up to be on as many apps as possible. That's my recommendation here. And it's amazing how many podcasters I speak to and how many businesses with podcasts that are just on a few different podcasting apps and not as many as possible. And on to podcasting in the report. So there's only been a marginal increase in familiarity of podcasting. So from 78% in 2021 to 79% in 2022. That's an estimated 226 million. But what about listening? Well, the number of people who say they've ever listened to a podcast is 62%. And then the monthly listeners is estimated at 38%, and that's jumped down from 41%. It's higher than it was in 2020 at 38%, but it's still lower than it was in 2021. And weekly is the same as well. That's at 26%, down from 28% in 2021. Now, Edison Research have said that they think this is about the pandemic and this a sign of the times of the past few years that we've had. And a large reason for this is people going back to work or to school, or people getting out of the house more, and people's habits are changing. There's a dip with younger people and older people in podcast listening, and then there's been a growth in the age range of age 25 to 54. So I think the key message here really is we are getting back to pre-pandemic listener levels and awareness levels, and actually just a bit higher than pre-pandemic, but lower than the peak of 2021. Now, the report also looks at sex and ethnicity of the people listening to podcasts and gives some really interesting information. So I recommend go take a look at that. It's really great to see the diversity in podcast listeners. Interestingly, they looked at the social media platforms that podcast listeners listen to the most, and Facebook was in the lead there with 40%. Instagram 21%, TikTok 12%, Twitter 8%. Now, I always say this, but if you have a podcast, it needs to be promoted on social media. And this information just reminds us that our listeners are definitely there. And that's most likely the place where people who don't know about us will find out about us. And it's also the place where our existing audience hear about our content regularly. So they're on other platforms and they'll hear about that latest podcast episode, and then they'll go to the podcasting apps to listen. They don't all necessarily follow and subscribe. Sometimes we need to remind the people who know about us about our most recent content. And even if they do, let's encourage them to go and have a listen. So if you're a podcaster, just a few things to think about there. Also, what's really interesting, on average, people listen to 8 podcasts a week. So how can you be in that 8? So they might find you on social media or via your blog or videos, or you guesting on someone else's show or talking at an event perhaps or elsewhere. But they will only stay if your content is good. So you need to focus on quality and really know your audience, because you need to be in those 8 podcasts that they will listen to on a weekly basis. So it's really important that we find people where they are. So we know there are 26% of people listening to podcasts on a weekly basis. So there's an estimated 26%. If you're a podcaster, ask yourself, what are the other 74% doing if they're not listening to the podcasts? Are they watching videos, reading? Are they on TikTok? How will you get in front of them? What's the most efficient way to get in front of them if you're already a podcaster? And my answer is repurposing. And this goes for other creators too. If you're creating video content, there will be a percentage that never really watch videos. How are you reaching that other percentage that don't watch videos? We should be focusing our core pillar content in one format, but then we should be repurposing it for other formats and other platforms. Now, there are literally hundreds of podcast episodes and videos and blog posts on content10x.com on our website that provide really specific, helpful advice on how to do this. There's also my book, Content 10x. You can grab a copy on Amazon, and that provides guidance on repurposing as well, on pretty much repurposing every type of content. You need to get good at this, and you need to build systems that work so that you are repurposing your content from your core pillar, longer form content, onto other platforms and in different formats. Of course, if you need help with this, then do get in touch with us at Content 10x. We offer a fully end-to-end content repurposing service for video and audio content. So head to content10x.com if you want to find more about how we could help you. Okay, so that's all for this week's episode. I hope you found this rundown of what I think some of the key important findings are from the Infinite Dial 2022. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that discussion and thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoy the Content 10x podcast, then why not hit that subscribe button on your podcast listening app of choice so that you can get updated when new episodes are released. And I'd really, really appreciate it if you could leave a review as well. That really makes a difference for the podcast. Also, please do get a copy of my book, Content 10x, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results. It is the ultimate guide to repurposing every type of content, and it's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback and also in audiobook as well. And you can head to content10x.com/book to find all the other places that you can get a copy of my book. And if you would like us to do your content repurposing for you, then we offer a fully end-to-end done for you content repurposing service. This is for podcasters and video content creators. We have our podcast 10x, video 10x, and also our specific LinkedIn 10x service, helping you to become the leading authority in your industry on LinkedIn. You can find out so much more about our services on our website. And also, please do give me a follow on the social media platforms. I share lots and lots of tips and advice on social media about content repurposing. I'm at Content 10x on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And if you try content10x.com/LinkedIn, you'll find my LinkedIn profile over there as well. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.